discussion. I just want to thank Chris Griffin and his team at FPI for partnering with us and us partnering with them on this briefing. It's always a pleasure to work with FPI. The U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and Foreign Policy Initiative share a very deep conviction that international affairs programs, development, and diplomacy are critical tools for advancing America's interests abroad. As we all know, there is no shortage of both challenges and opportunities around the world, from Syria to Venezuela, Ukraine, Tunisia. I mean, the list just is too numerous to mention. There are vital national security interests at stake. There's issues related to our economic competitiveness and also to our ability to advance the ideals of freedom, democracy, and human rights at stake in all of these places around the world. And what all of these challenges and opportunities require is a mix of both hard and soft power. It's military tools in some cases, but it's also the non-military tools of development and diplomacy. So before I turn it over to Chris to kick us off, let me just say a few words about the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for those of you that might not be familiar with us. The Washington Post calls it a strange bedfellows network because we have a pretty eclectic mix of members. We're about 400 businesses and NGOs ranging from CARE and Catholic Relief Services, the Chamber of Commerce, Caterpillar, to Walmart, World Wildlife Fund, and World Vision. We have a group of about 152 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, as General Sullivan is here today representing. And these are men and women who have served very distinguished careers in our military and believe very strongly that not only do we need a strong military, but we need a strong State Department, USAID, MCC, IRI, and many, many other programs. We also have grasshops, if you will, network of members around the country in every state. These are business leaders, community leaders, faith-based leaders, veterans in many cases, veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who have served abroad and have seen how important it is to have the civilians represented. And so USGLC is focused on not only ensuring adequate funding for the international affairs budget that funds all these tools we're going to talk about today, but also kind of strengthening their effectiveness, their transparency, and their accountability. And, it really comes down to these are the right things to do from a humanitarian and moral point of view, but they're the smart thing to do in terms of our national interests. And in many cases, they are very, very cost-effective, far more cost-effective, both in lives and dollars than having to use our military. So with that, I want to turn it over to Chris Griffin, the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. Chris has been with the Foreign Policy Initiative for about 2 years.
Just a shade over 1.
Oh, wow. Okay. Trying to advance the clock a little bit. And before coming to FBI, he was here in the Senate as Legislative Director for Senator Joe Lieberman. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Chris to the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. We'll share this. As returning compliments go, it's an incredible pleasure to work with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition to put together this event and welcome you on this rainy afternoon for a discussion of foreign assistance and economic and national security. The Foreign Policy Initiative, if you're not familiar with us as an organization, we were established 5 years ago. This is our anniversary to speak to the importance of American leadership and engagement in the world. And since FBI was established, one of the topics that we have continuously focused on is the role of foreign assistance as a component of that leadership and engagement, both to advance our economic interests, our national security interests, but also the aspects of human dignity that are intertwined with prosperity and the engagement that we can achieve from that role. As an FPI note, before I introduce our speakers, I want to point out that this is a conversation we'll be continuing throughout the year, and in part through our 2014 Congressional Scholars Program. There will be a series of weekly briefings this summer focused on U.S. engagement with the Middle East and, of course, the role that foreign assistance and military assistance plays in our relationships as the countries there, those that are successfully continuing democratic transitions and those that have seen those transitions interrupted or forestalled. We'll introduce our speakers today in the order that they'll be speaking, starting from my immediate right. Mr. John Murphy is Vice President of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's also responsible for representing the Chamber before the administration, Congress, and foreign officials. Prior to working at the Chamber, Mr. Murphy oversaw Latin America-related programs at the International Republican Institute, and he serves on USGLC's Board of Directors. Speaking next will be Ambassador Mark Green, who joined the International Republican Institute as its president in January of this year. His service in government includes representing Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1999 to 2007, and from 2007 to 2009 serving as the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania. Ambassador Green has also served as Senior Director for U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and as President and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, a nonprofit organization that engages corporate leaders to reduce poverty through business growth and investment in Africa. Speaking last will be Lieutenant General James N. Solligan, United States Air Force retired, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Transformation and Allied Command Transformation from 2006 to 2010. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff for United Nations Command and U.S. Forces Korea. He spent his early operational years as a C-130 pilot, instructor pilot, and flight examiners. He's also a member of USGLC's National Security Advisory Council. And with that, Mr. Murphy, if you would please kick off our conversation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. This was the last will be first, and the first will be last here today. But it is a great pleasure to speak on behalf of the U.S. business community about the importance of the international affairs budget. As Todd pointed out, the USGLC is a kind of strange bedfellows coalition bringing together these different sectors. So I'm focusing just narrowly on what this means to the business community. And we really come at these issues in a very particular way. If you've ever driven past the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the north side of Lafayette Park, you'll see we've got this sign out front that's got 30-foot high letters. It says JOBS, jobs. And that's where a lot of our member companies approach this. Today, if you're looking for growth, if you're looking for new customers, companies large and small are increasingly looking overseas. You know, I was pointing out that 80% of the world's purchasing power, 92% of its economic growth, 95% of its population lives somewhere else. And if we're going to have an economic recovery in this country that really gets traction, that really starts to reach the kinds of levels of economic growth we've had in past recoveries, one way that we're going to have to do that has to be through international trade and investment. And already there is success on this front. People don't always know that their jobs depend on trade, but many of them do. It's about 1 in 3 factory jobs depends on exports. 1 in 3 acres on American farms is planted for exports. The United States is by far the world's largest exporter of services as well, about $600 billion last year. And these exports have been growing pretty significantly in recent years. And it's not just big companies. We've just passed the 300,000 mark for the number of companies that export, and 97% of them are small and mid-sized companies, which make up the vast bulk of our membership. So in that context, the international affairs budget really plays a vital role to help U.S. companies tap those foreign markets. It supports the diplomats who are out there on the front lines of U.S. commercial diplomacy and their export promotion efforts. It provides technical advice so that developing countries can adopt more open and accountable legal and economic policies, and so become better markets in the bargain. And this is, we see this in the statistics as well, that in the past couple of years, for the first time, the developing world is accounting for over half of U.S. exports, and that's where we're seeing the fastest growth. But the reality is that U.S. companies do risk falling behind if the U.S. federal government fails to maintain a significant economic presence overseas to make sure that there's a level playing field. The competition is very fierce if you look at the fast-growing markets in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And firms from other world regions are very actively increasing their presence in those markets. And that competition is only becoming more intense. Not to pick on China, but some studies estimate that China's government-supported economic development programs in the regions I just mentioned grew 25-fold between 2002 and 2007. And China's first official report on foreign aid policy, the Chinese government indicated that its budgeted foreign aid grew by nearly 30% per year between 2004 and 2009. The U.S. and other developed economies have been moving away from tied aid, but China's development assistance is very often contingent on requirements that countries purchase goods and services from Chinese companies. So, for example, the Chinese government has offered loans to African governments on the condition that they buy telecommunications equipment only from Chinese companies. So this is a very challenging environment for U.S. companies. And it's really one where the bottom line is that unilateral disarmament by not funding, by underfunding the U.S. international affairs budget can have a real cost for our ability to tap those markets. To conclude my brief comments, I just wanted to give a little case study here about Colombia. Colombia is really an interesting example of how the international affairs budget and all the tools of U.S. foreign policy can come together in a useful way. Colombia had decades of narcotics-funded insurgencies and was really on the border of becoming a failed state in 1999 when the U.S. and Colombian leaders launched Plan Colombia, this multifaceted partnership. It had brought together security elements, development assistance, direct government technical aid. It was a time when more than 11,000 Colombian towns had no government presence at all. So actually more than 80% of the territory was lawless. Fast forward to today, there's been substantial improvements in security, and that lawlessness is basically gone. The level of violence in the country has plummeted. U.S. government development assistance helped to build infrastructure, medical care, and education. It was very important on the security front, but it wasn't just security. It was all of these tools coming together. So we've seen a very sharp decline in narcotics trade. And meanwhile, the legitimate economy has boomed. Colombia has enjoyed GDP growth of about 5% per year for the better part of a decade. And here in my notes, it says it's now the fourth largest economy in Latin America. It's actually the third. I just saw somebody tweet this week that they've overtaken Argentina. And to cap it off, as many of you know, the United States entered into a free trade agreement with Colombia. And it was approved by Congress in 2011, entered into force the following year. And in the first 12 months of that, we're starting to see the fruits here that U.S. exports to Colombia grew by more than 20% in that first year. And in some areas, like for manufactured goods, the growth was 61%. For agricultural goods, 74%. So there is a payoff here for the investment that the United States has made. It's a humanitarian payoff. It's a payoff that we see in our security interests, but it's also one that translates back to economic growth and jobs here at home. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks to FPI and, of course, USGLC for this opportunity to be with you. In some ways, my remarks will be a bridge between the messages that you hear from my co-panelists, because I agree with the thrust of what they're saying. I would summarize my support for the international affairs budget with three phrases, and I'll explain what they mean. First one is a rising tide. Second one is send us last. And the third one is our soul. Not something we hear very often here in the halls of the Capitol. So what does that mean? A rising tide. So 40 years ago, famously, John F. Kennedy said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." And what that really points to is the importance of economic growth to everything else that we do. If we were recovering in this current recession at the same economic growth rate that we have in the last 10 recessions that we've suffered since World War II, our per capita income in this country would be nearly $4,000 higher, and there would be 12 million more jobs. And what that points to is that the parties may disagree on some of the details and specifics, and they may disagree, and certainly they do disagree on some of the terminology, but they really do agree that economic growth is the centerpiece to government policy in our future. And just as importantly, economists all agree that trade and exports are the centerpiece of economic growth. John's laid out some great statistics. Trade has tripled as a percentage of our economy. And it isn't complicated, as John said. 95% of the world's population lives outside the borders of the U.S. And I think sometimes, as a former member, I can say this, sometimes policymakers are afraid to lay out the obvious and to confront some of the fallacies that are out there. When people say to you or ask you why it's important that we have to care about what's going on in Central America or the Middle East, look, it's about our economic future. My father-in-law, the corn and soybean farmer back in southern Wisconsin, he'll be the first to say he doesn't know a lot about much of the world, but what he does get is that if he can't export, he might as well plow those fields under. Because if he were growing corn and soybeans only for the domestic market, it would be a fraction of where it is today. If we can't export, if we can't trade, our economy collapses. But I think what we don't talk about often enough is, as John pointed to, where the real export opportunities lie. 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. We think a lot about Europe for trade, and we should, it's important, but it is the developing world where the greatest market opportunities lie. And I wish I could tell you that was a secret, that nobody else knew that, but of course it's not true. Countries like China have invested billions in Africa alone. And trade between Africa and China has literally exploded. But what's real important to remember is that this isn't about China. It's about us. It's about what we choose to do in the world marketplace. And for my money, failing to make investments in some of those tools that create a landscape where we can invest and where we can trade, that's unilateral disarmament of our economy. I was on a panel in Ethiopia last year with a number of African business leaders and a number of members and former members. And one of the members asked a Tanzanian businessman why it was that he went with a Chinese company as his trade partner. He said because they were there and you weren't. But very bluntly, he said, look, most Africans and African businessmen want to work with the U.S. They love U.S. economic principles. They love U.S. entrepreneurs. They're looking to partner. But we're not there. And so sadly, I think, in too many parts of Africa and the developing world, we're not in the game. We're simply not investing as we should be in those tools that create the partnerships and create the opportunities. And that's not about China, that's about us and what we choose to do. So the first reason, to me, to support the international affairs budget is because a rising tide does lift all boats and does make so many of our policy choices easier. Send us in last. I would argue, in general will I know, that investing in diplomacy, and development is vital to our national security. I served as ambassador in Tanzania. In 1998, terrorists struck the embassy in Tanzania and Kenya simultaneously. It was a devastating blow. But in the years after that terrible tragedy, a very interesting thing happened. That day in August, in 1998, going into it, Tanzania was a largely left-leaning, eastward-looking nation. Right after the terrible bombing, the U.S. came to the Tanzanians and said, look, we're partners in this. And so you saw a number of programs brought to Tanzania. The AIDS Initiative, PEPFAR, Millennium Challenge Corporation, the largest compact in the world, is there. The President's Malaria Initiative, now Power Africa, now Feed the Future. And a very interesting thing happened in that relationship. 10 years later, 2008, I'm ambassador, and we have the first ever official visit by a sitting U.S. president. And not just a sitting U.S. president, but a conservative sitting U.S. president during a time of war. And yet, President Bush was treated like a conquering hero. The streets were crowded and filled with supporters. And President Bush got it. He said, look, this isn't about me. This is about that flag that's waving, the U.S. flag. The fact that we stood shoulder to shoulder with the Tanzanians to help them take on their poverty challenges that too often can lead to extremism. It is a matter of national security, and these development programs are vital to it. Interesting now, one of the least covered highlights of that trip that President Bush made was at the very end of it, before he left, we stood in front of Air Force One with about 24 Tanzanian soldiers who had just finished training to become peacekeepers that went to Lebanon and Darfur, quite frankly, so our men and women didn't have to. So you went from a left-leaning country who was a distant friend at best to a country willing to participate to preserve peace and security in other parts of the world. So I would argue that investments in diplomacy and development help ensure that the last people that have to go in are men and women in uniform. And finally, soul. I would argue to you that investments in these tools are good for our soul. They're part of the American DNA. I lead an organization, the International Republican Institute, that was launched by a speech that Ronald Reagan gave at Westminster to the British Parliament in 1982. And he looked out to that crowd and he said, look, we simply don't believe that democracy and freedom are the sole prerogative of elected few. We believe that this is something universal that men and women should have access to. And I think that is in the makeup of this country, who we are. We do believe in freedom, and we do believe in taking the blessings that we have and reaching out to willing partners, not opposing, but where other peoples and other countries are interested in lifting their own fortunes and having a bite of the apple of liberty and freedom. That's part of who we are. We reach out. And so I would argue that this is right in our soul. This is who we are as Americans. So again, to me, the three main reasons are a rising tide lifts all boats, trade and exports get our economy going and create those good paying jobs. Secondly, making investments, development, diplomacy going into these areas help minimize the chances that we're going to have to send in hard power, which is costly to our treasure, far more importantly, costly in terms of the human sacrifice that all too often gets made, and finally is part of who we are. We're Americans, and we do believe in certain values and principles. Thanks.
I can't top that. Thank you, Ambassador. That's exactly what I was going to say, so we can open it up for questions now. No, I'm Jim Soligan. I had 38 years in the Air Force. And I actually participated in Plan Colombia. I spent my time in Colombia helping the Colombian government develop their whole-of-government solutions to their problem. And I worked alongside Rand Beers and his folks who did the development pieces, which included hospitals, security, training of law enforcement, training of legal systems. All of those things to help the Colombian government be able to basically defend its own territory. And today, Colombia has exported that security and that counter-narcotics mission to Afghanistan. So again, it's an example of where you help a country be able to help itself. Then in fact, they become contributing members just like Tanzania and Colombia and other areas of the world. But let me go back to a little bit about my story. So I came in, actually, I was serving in Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. I actually gave the Panama Canal back when I was in Panama. They sent me to Korea and I thought I was going to fix that problem. I didn't quite fix that.
We'll get that one.
I didn't get that one finished. But the world was really focused, when we thought about security, we thought about security largely from a defending of territorial borders. That was really how we thought about it, how I grew up in the Cold War, thinking about security. Today, when we think about security, the number one threat to the security, most nations perceive it, is driven by failed and failing states. It's about the internal governments and the internal support structures of those nations that can't provide the security and provide the means for their own people. And that has a knock-on effect. That has an effect of migration. You can look across Africa and you can see where there's been starvation or where corruption has happened. You just saw Captain Phillips and the whole Somalia piece. But you can pick, across, even in the Ukraine today, it's a failed and failing state issue. It's not about, you need military power to go out and defend, in that case, the security. So what I've grown up with is this transition from this mindset that the military was there largely to defend borders, and it still has a very important role to be able to do that, and we've developed the best military in the world. But that is one tool in the toolkit. And it's really an error on our part, and the only tool in the toolkit that we reach in for is the military, and that's the first thing that you use, or it's the only thing that we use, as opposed to saying, what else can our country do collectively alongside the military, or perhaps in front of the military, to prevent the need or to delay the need for actually using the military as we go. So whether it was in Bosnia, where all those countries now are part of Afghanistan, support and ISAF, to democracies in Latin America, where in fact you help those nations. So as I have gone through this process, I represent, as Todd said, more than 150 retired 3 and 4 stars, and every retired Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense who have supported a better balance between the foreign assistance budget and the military budget in order to be able to say we have to have both. We have to have more tools in the toolkit so that we're not sending the military in to do non-military things. If we look at Egypt today, and the cause of the Egyptian problem, it was never a military problem. Okay? It's about democracy, it's about people's rights, it's about economics, but if we don't help them in the soft areas, it will become a military problem because you get the Suez Canal and you got all the other things out there. So if you look around the world and you ask yourself the question, how can we use AID, how can you use diplomatic trade and the support of the United States economically to be able to help these countries develop their democratic institutions, then in fact by doing that we postpone, perhaps delay, and certainly in some cases strengthen the ability of the nations to take on their own security, and then we do assistance as opposed to actual war fighting. So I'll stop there because I want to have a lot of questions. But I would make one other point that I think is very important, and that is a challenge that's associated with our budgeting process. where we get these big spikes up and down as we kind of look at the predictability of foreign assistance and foreign aid. What I have found in my time, whether it was visiting Iraq or Afghanistan or any of these other places that I've been to, is that the people who are out in front with the local folks developing their economic assistance, democratic principles, education and all of that, they are successful based on personal relationships. And it takes many years of those personal relationships to build the trust and confidence that in fact both you're going to be there and that what you're doing has a successful conclusion at the end of it. And one of the challenges that we have is when we go through these last-minute big budget cuts associated with foreign assistance, in particular the soft side of foreign assistance to AID and others, is that you pull the people out of the field and you can't put them in to that exact same position the next year and not have to start all over again because all of the trust and all the personal relationships and confidence have gone. Okay? So it's much better to have a steady, predictable level of assistance that's in balance as opposed to one that spikes up and then gets cut and then next year it spikes back up again. It's starting all over. And so I'll stop on that, and there are lots of other examples and stories that we could tell, but I really think your questions are very important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all three for those excellent remarks. Before opening it to the audience, would like to pose a question to the panel. One of the things that is of particular interest to this audience, and I think as they prepare their bosses for hearings, for the questions they'll face in the future, it relates to work that USGLC does, which is it sets up events, programs, conversations nationwide, where you have an opportunity to speak to the constituents of the staff's bosses, and both hear what they're saying, what are their understandings of U.S. foreign assistance engagement in the world, and the points that you find to be most compelling in speaking with them. And certainly from your experience in Congress, Ambassador Green, that's something that you've experienced directly. Would appreciate it if you could articulate as you participate in broader USGLC events, that be it from the Chamber's perspective, with the business community, with broader national community ambassador, and with military representatives, that what is it that you hear, what are the major misunderstandings that you continuously find yourselves batting down, and what are the points that you find most effective in making that connection to the constituents and ultimately control the keys?
Thanks, Chris. I think the biggest misconception is how much money we're actually spending when it comes to foreign assistance. And I'm sure many of you have seen this, but every year for a number of years, when the public has been polled about how much money or what percentage of the federal budget goes towards foreign assistance, you see wild numbers of 25% and 10% and 15%. And of course, we're talking about 1%. When it comes to development assistance in particular. So I think that's the biggest thing, because people have this misconception that, okay, well, if we just cut out foreign assistance for a year or two, that takes care of the debt, and the deficit will be just fine. And of course, it's, I actually heard one member refer to it the right way and said, it's like saying you're going to lose 50 pounds, and so you give yourself a haircut. And that's literally what we're talking about when it comes to the foreign affairs budget, the foreign assistance budget. So I think that's the biggest thing.
I think, based on personal experience of my mother-in-law's question, is why are we sending money overseas when we can use it better in the United States? And I think most Americans focus, I mean, it's a generalization, but I mean, they really don't understand the 3 points that were made across here, like the significant portion of our exports that go to, or the significant portion of our trade that's really about exports, and then which ones of those go to some of these areas that are less stable than others, in particular the developing nations. And the importance of the U.S. engagement in those developing nations, because half of your trade, as you said, external trade is tied up in supporting those. So I think that there's really the number one question that I get, the number one question when we meet with the congressman is how do they stand up in front of their constituents and talk about the importance of the soft side of the State Department budget, AID, and foreign assistance, why we send money to Egypt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it all comes back down to the most compelling argument is about trade in those local communities that has benefited. I mean, I can stand up and talk about our military piece, and you can talk about all the soul piece, but the number one thing for the American people out there is to really create that job that your father who was in the soybeans. Is he making money out of the street? So that's how it goes.
I agree with all those comments. Just to add one more, though, it's really striking the degree to which people across the country think that Americans don't make anything anymore, that we don't export. The United States is the largest manufacturing power in the world. We're about a fifth of all manufacturing, and $1 trillion of that was exported last year. I think what happens is that if you go to Walmart and look at the shelves and you see many imported products, what you don't see, of course, is the exports. The exports are somewhere else. And the United States often excels in making capital goods, not consumer goods. So, machine tools, Caterpillar tractors, and so on. So that to the degree to which we really are dependent on the ability to sell goods in these foreign markets, I think is underappreciated. And we're constantly striving to make that case as well. It really is. It's already that important, and it could be so much more.
But one of the things that I participated in lots of these, and one of the things that a lot of the business community talks about is that they need to have enough predictability that the U.S. is committed to security in those countries before our companies will go over and make an investment. How do they protect their investment? Is the U.S. really committed to, as a government, to the security of those nations? So if the U.S. is not involved at all, politically and economically, as a government, then you find it pretty hard for business to go in there because they're not sure whether they're going to get nationalized or whatever as it goes. You may have some other views on this.
All right, great. Thank you, gentlemen. As we shift to the question and answers, the Q&A portion is off the record, so please leave frank, and of course be frank and the answers you can expect. Ask that you please identify yourself and the office that you work for as you ask a question. The floor is open. Yes, sir.
I have one question for Ambassador. I'm from China Embassy. Since now you mentioned that China's company is in Africa, but the U.S. company is not. My question is there any reason to start American company there?
There are a number of reasons, but one of them is ignorance. Quite frankly, I think many American companies have stereotypes about what they'll find in Africa. Part of it is we're sort of all a victim of what we see in the television sets every night. You turn on TV, if you see something about Africa, it's either game parks or protests. And of course, in so much of Africa, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. And so I think that's one of the big reasons. But there is another reason, a more serious reason, that I think is tied directly to our subject matter today. As I have so often said to my former colleagues, you could have trade deals struck with many countries in Africa, American-style trade agreements, and would have very little effect. And the reason for that is that these countries lack capacity to process, to deal with regulations, to enforce rule of law. Well, that's actually what the international affairs budget does. So one of the biggest reasons why business does and should support these development and diplomacy tools is because sound investments in this area can create the conditions, the landscape in some of the developing countries that allow American businesses to compete. I've often pointed to the country where I serve, Tanzania, where there is no private ownership of land. And where the land records are all messed up. Well, I mean, one American company is going to make a major investment in the country, but they don't have predictable land records and enforcement of a commercial code. For literally, walking around money in the federal budget, you could take care of those things. USAID has a number of programs that address those conditions. William Challenge Corporation works on land records and some other issues. IRI, National Democratic Institute, our sister organization, we work on capacity and rule of law. If you take care of those things, then I would argue the government should get out of the way and American business will take off. But we don't see those investments because the budget simply isn't sufficient to do it at this point. So part of it is American businesses don't have strong enough contacts where I think have an understanding of the reality of the ground in these countries. And secondly, what American business often needs, which is predictability and enforcement of rule of law, we don't see. State-owned enterprises actually don't need the same things. It's a different calculation. That's another reason why I think you see Chinese investment in Africa rising and American investment rising, but not as quickly. Again, I argue that it's not about China, it's about the U.S. and whether or not we're going to get into the game and whether we're going to be competitive. I believe that we can do extraordinarily well in a competition, a business competition, but we need to make those kinds of investments that create the conditions that allow the businesses to come in and compete.
And in a globalized world, the pressures for that kind of intellectual property rights, the ability to make an investment and know that your oil fields aren't going to get nationalized and those kind of things. There was a joke about Russia and said, one wall went down and they need another wall called Wall Street, where they actually have a market that we can invest in companies like that. So all the legal things.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Danny Walsh with Senator Coates' office. General, you mentioned the relationships, personal relationships that must be built and how who you know matters, not just in small scale personally, but internationally. What do you think the impact of our abrupt and near total withdrawal from Afghanistan will have on the prospects for economic success there, based on the fact that the relationships we do have there are primarily military?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that I think that our relationship there is far more than military. I think the visible piece of what you see is military, but an awful lot of what's happening in the countryside are all your AID and your other State Department programs that are out there. So there are tremendous programs for education, for digging wells, for building schools, for building hospitals, and I think that those kinds of that kind of trusting relationship is important. I would probably use Pakistan as an example of where we have taken legislative action to actually isolate our ability to interact with senior leaders. So if you go to Pakistan and you look at their very senior people, they had built up relationships with the United States military and come over to our war colleges and done a lot of those things. And so we have a fair amount of influence. After we went through the congressional language that prohibited that, we are totally disconnected. Totally is probably too. We are largely disconnected from middle and junior officers who have become more radicalized. And so your ability to actually influence their decisions and their actions is far less. So I'm the J5 in the U.S. Southern Command, okay, which is the Director of Planning and Policy. And our deputy commander was a guy named Freddie Valenzuela. And there was about to be a coup in Ecuador. And he called up his war college classmate. And by the way, 3 of his classmates were either president of the country, chief of defense, or the chief of the army. And he would call them up all the time and have those kinds of relationships and talks about, the role of democracy, the role of military democracy, and not to overthrow and those kinds of things. So those kinds of relationships that start out and last a lifetime in a career are really, really important. It's not just something that happens because you met somebody one time. I mean, that's better than not meeting them, but and today I'll use China as an example. Investing a tremendous amount of money in inviting senior military leaders in Latin America to go to the professional military education colleges in China in order to have them build those relationships and learn their tactics and the way they think. So that's not bad, it's not good. Whereas we've drawn down our ability to bring that kind of engagement together, other nations are expanding that because they see the importance of those relationships.
Next question.
Hi, Stephanie Hammond. I'm with Congressman Trent Frank's office. I have a question about Burma and Burma emerging from a pariah state, making modest reforms in the last few years, and the role of U.S. foreign assistance with a country such as Burma, and particularly how U.S. foreign assistance, the lifting and relief of certain sanctions, maybe even human rights training, can help incentivize Burma to embrace further reforms.
Hi, Stephanie. Actually, Burma is one of IRI's largest programs. It's an important program to us, and part of what we do there is to help modernize and build the capacity of political parties, because countries that are moving towards democracy and are taking their first steps often don't have traditions in elective government and responsive government. So we teach local elected officials and parties how to measure constituent concerns, how to be responsive, how to build those structures that allow for government to be based upon responding to individual needs and concerns. And I would argue that in a country like Burma, which has come from a long period of darkness, just making early steps, don't oversell it, but making early steps, that's one of the most important investments we can make. There are tremendous economic interests there if it continues to move in the right direction, and that's part of what the U.S. government, through USAID and through state investment.
Pastor Green, just to follow up on that question, because it is an interesting point in terms of the influence of the United States as exercised in countries that became democratic. The challenges that we exercise in a country like Egypt. I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit to the experience there. And certainly South Korea is this dramatic success story that's really now an international aid partner. Where do you see the breakdown between success and failure in some of those challenges?
Well, first off, South Korea, as you rightly noted, is one of the great success stories of not just the U.S., but the U.S. had a huge role in making investments early on in providing training and support. As countries emerge into democracies, they oftentimes, their structures and principles reflect those countries that were standing shoulder to shoulder with them at the time. And so now you see a South Korea, which is not only a major aid donor, but I actually had a meeting 3 days ago with a South Korean NGO, which is looking to get involved in democracy training around the world. And they argue that because they have gotten to the point in their development where they have begun to sort of reap the harvest of the blessings where democratic partners did with them, it's their turn to give back. And so it's, a wonderful story. Obviously what's happening in Egypt is more than tragic and deeply disturbing. And I wish I could tell you I know exactly where it's going to go and how it's going to go. But the difficult thing is, when you look at crises like this, is that the natural reaction of a lot of people is to say, okay, that's enough. I can't deal with it anymore. Well, someone explain to me how the world gets better if the U.S. walks away. So as difficult as some of this is, as messy as some of it is, sometimes we're communicating with people that bother us and should bother us. On the other hand, withdrawing from the world stage clearly not means. So as difficult as it is, if the U.S. isn't going to provide leadership, someone tell me how things are going to get better and who will provide the leadership. So as difficult as it is, we have to stay involved.
Yes, sir.
I think we all understand from a big picture perspective why foreign assistance is so important, but one question similar to the one Congress often get from constituents is, as foreign aid helps open up markets for export abroad, doesn't it also open up labor markets abroad that might take away from American jobs? And although intellectually we sort of know the answer to that, how do you phrase that? How do you respond to a constituent in trying to make the argument that this isn't going to hurt your job here at home?
As we have a clear responding to constituents, and
I'll let my brother in the chamber.
this is the chamber's
Sure. Well, I think it's the trade playing field isn't always fair. Our market, we have an average tariff on goods coming in is 1.2%. 70% of it's actually zero. But when you're looking at foreign markets, it's vastly higher. And a typical developing country is 5%, it's 10%. For key, in Malaysia, the tariff on U.S. autos going in is 35%. It's just not fair. So the kinds of engagement that we have through trade agreements, which get rid of those barriers on both sides, we at the Chamber and many others in the business community have long argued that that's overwhelmingly in the interest of U.S. workers and companies, because we're giving up this in terms of the protection that we have today. The international affairs budget is what I've just said, it's more about trade policy, but trying to get to this concern about competing with the foreign workers. International affairs budget, I think, is also an important element in helping us to tap those foreign markets, because you look around the world and a lot of big dollar sales. The president of France is not shy about traveling with a big delegation to India to sell Airbus planes. If we don't have the diplomats and U.S. commercial service staff on the ground who are going to be able to help make those sales, there are some kinds of sales that you're just not going to get the deal. So again, it comes back to this notion of unilateral disarmament.
My name is Bixby. I'm from Florence in the Post Office. And I wanted to know in establishing those relationships with countries like those on the continent of Africa, how do you make sure that U.S. companies follow the same regulations, environmental regulations that they do here, there, so that health-wise things are not affected by oil going into certain communities or things of that sort?
We live in a world where your name is your brand, and it's all important to a company doing business globally. Nothing that happens anywhere really stays hidden. In country after country, what we see in survey data is working for a U.S. company is it's typically the most sought after job. Brazil is a country I've worked a lot with, and there's a lot of U.S. investment there, and the wages that are paid there in the U.S. companies that are invested in Brazil are typically significantly higher than the average salaries. The working conditions are better, the benefits are better, and I think that's because these companies are organized in a way that the productivity is high and wages are tied to productivity. That's what the economists would say. But it comes back to your brand, and companies know that that if they don't do that, then the world is going to see, and it's going to cost them in the long run.
Also, American businesses are more heavily regulated than almost any businesses in the world. And there is a lot of scrutiny. So again, when you're dealing with far-off land, the question is, are we going to bring Western standards, heavily regulated standards into those operations, or are we going to cede the territory to other countries that may not follow the same rules, and procedures, and regulations? And that really is the issue. It's not the U.S. versus nobody. It's the U.S. versus other actors that may not view things the same way that we do. The other piece to it is, at the same time that we're promoting U.S. investment in many of these countries, we're also promoting building governing capacity in many of these countries. And so by building the capacity of elected officials in these countries to be able to be responsive, to have the capacity to regulate, to follow the rule of law appropriately, everybody wins. So U.S. in a competitive world market has a chance to compete and understand. I can tell you as a former ambassador, I never went to the Tanzanian government and said, oh, by the way, you have to take an American business. The only thing I ever argued for was, you got to give an American business a chance to compete. If we lose, okay, we lose. That's the way competition works, as long as we have a chance to compete. So I think the investments that we make lift everybody's standards up. They create opportunities in markets, but they also build the capacity of these host country governments to say no or to regulate. So I think everybody wins.
Time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
I'm Chris Doyle from American University. Mr. Murphy, you mentioned at the beginning to the regulations regarding foreign aid and the use of funds towards US goods. Do you think that complies with US values towards fair and open markets and also the values and principles of the World Trade Organization?
Yes, my comment was about tide aid, and the point I was making is that the United States no longer employs tide aid. And that's, I think that's something that's important from a development perspective. It gives local enterprises in a developing country an opportunity to be providers. I think one of the critiques that sometimes is made about foreign aid, often wrongly, is this idea that, sure, it's foreign aid for this other country, but it's just coming back to the U.S. companies here. That's not really the point. And if we still had tide aid, that would indeed be the problem. But I think that's been a positive evolution, and it's one that it should continue.
One of the questions I thought we would get, because I know we're coming to a close, is one about the effectiveness of the money that we spend. Because I think the second question that I would have said, the toughest question to answer, is really about waste and corruption and whatever associated with ineffectiveness of the government bureaucracies and foreign assistance. If I had one message that I think that each one of you could take back to your congressional representatives, it would be about the importance of continuing to focus on effectiveness of the use of the money and the assistance that's out there. Our government counts activity. So when they say, okay, what are you doing? You say, well, we spent all the money and we held this many classes or we did this many